I had spent more than 30 years sitting behind the bench of a busy courtroom, watching thousands of people walk through those heavy wooden doors. And over the years I learned that you can usually tell a lot about someone in the first 10 seconds after they enter the room, because the truly remorseful walk slowly with their eyes down. The frightened ones look around nervously, as if the walls themselves are judging them. But every once in a while, someone walks in carrying an invisible shield made of arrogance and privilege, convinced that consequences are things that happen only to other people. And that morning, the person who walked in with that kind of confidence was a 24-year-old woman named Alexandra Whitmore, the daughter of a billionaire technology executive whose family name was attached to half the buildings downtown. And she didn't just arrive late to court. She arrived in a way that made it clear she didn't believe the rules applied to her at all. Because while the courtroom had already been waiting nearly 20 minutes, the doors finally opened, and she stepped in wearing a cream-colored designer dress that probably cost more than many people earn in months. High heels clicking loudly across the tile floor. Sunglasses still covering her eyes, as if she were walking into a luxury hotel rather than a courtroom, where she was facing serious charges. And behind her rushed a sharply dressed attorney, who looked both embarrassed and exhausted as he quickly apologized for the delay, blaming traffic. But Alexandra herself never said a word of apology. She simply walked to the defense table, placed her handbag down slowly, removed her sunglasses with deliberate calm, and leaned back in her chair as though the entire situation was nothing more than a minor inconvenience in her busy social calendar. And when I asked why she had arrived so late, she casually replied, "Traffic," with a shrug, not even pretending to show respect for the court. And that was the moment I knew this case was going to become something more than a routine traffic violation, because the file in front of me showed that 1 week earlier, Alexandra Whitmore had slammed her luxury SUV into the back of a minivan that had been stopped at a red light, a minivan being driven by a woman named Maria Chun, a hard-working hospice nurse who had been taking her 2 young children to school that morning. And the impact had been strong enough to push the vehicle forward several feet while the children screamed in the back seat, and Maria hit her head against the steering wheel. But according to witness statements, Alexandra had stepped out of her vehicle, glanced at the damage for only a moment, laughed dismissively, and said that the van was a piece of junk anyway, before getting back into her SUV and driving away from the scene without exchanging information, leaving a frightened mother and her children standing in the middle of the intersection, trying to understand what had just happened. And what made the situation worse was that Maria Chun didn't have the kind of resources people like Alexandra take for granted. Because when your car is destroyed and you are a single parent who works long shifts at a hospital caring for dying patients, losing transportation doesn't just inconvenience you. It disrupts your entire life. It means missing work, rearranging childcare, worrying about bills, and trying to comfort children who suddenly believe that riding in a car might not be safe anymore. And as Maria sat quietly in the courtroom, wearing the same hospital scrubs she had come in straight from a night shift, her wrist wrapped in a brace, and exhaustion written across her face, her children sat behind her, unusually silent for their age. The kind of silence that comes after fear settles deep into a child's mind. While Alexandra sat at the defense table tapping her fingernails against the wood as though the entire situation bored her. And when we played the traffic camera footage for the courtroom, the evidence spoke louder than any testimony ever could, because the video clearly showed Maria's minivan waiting patiently at the red light, then Alexandra's black Range Rover entering the frame too fast to stop, smashing into the back of the vehicle, Maria stepping out and rushing to check on her children before approaching the other driver, and Alexandra exiting her SUV, looking at the damage with visible annoyance before dismissively saying words that the microphone barely caught but the courtroom easily understood. calling the vehicle junk, and acting as though the accident itself was beneath her concern. Then casually climbing back into her SUV and driving around the damaged van, even running the red light as she left the scene entirely. And when the video ended and the screen went dark, I turned back toward Alexandra, expecting at least a moment of reflection or embarrassment. But instead, she simply shrugged again and said she didn't really remember what she had said because she had been stressed that day. And when I repeated that the video showed her insulting the victim's car, she gave a small smirk and said that it was true anyway, that the van was old and probably worthless compared to her own vehicle. And the reaction inside the courtroom was immediate as people gasped at the casual cruelty of the remark, while even her own attorney lowered his head in frustration. But Alexandra remained completely unaware of the damage her words were doing, not just legally but morally, because what she didn't yet understand was that the courtroom she was sitting in did not operate according to the rules of wealth or family reputation. And that belief began to crack when I asked her why she had never reported the accident to her insurance company until 3 days later, after the police tracked her down through the license plate captured on camera, and she responded that she had been busy with other commitments, including lunch at her country club and a golf game with friends, explaining it with the kind of casual tone people use when they talk about rescheduling a meeting rather than leaving a crash scene where 2 children had been terrified. And as the case unfolded, it became painfully clear that Alexandra's entire life had insulated her from consequences, because her driving record already showed multiple speeding tickets and previous reckless driving citations that had quietly disappeared after lawyers intervened. And when she eventually blurted out that her father's lawyer had assured her the case would probably be dismissed because of their family's standing in the community, the entire courtroom shifted, because those words revealed exactly why she had walked in with such confidence, believing the outcome had already been purchased before the hearing even began. But that was the moment I stopped the conversation and made something very clear to her in front of everyone present, telling her that in my courtroom I did not care who her father was, how much money her family had donated to charities, or what buildings carried their name, because the law recognizes only actions and responsibility, not privilege. And as the reality of that statement began to settle across her face for the first time that morning, the confidence she had entered with slowly started to fade, replaced by uncertainty as she realized that this was one situation where wealth could not rewrite what had already been captured on camera and witnessed by an entire courtroom full of people who understood something she was only beginning to learn: that accountability eventually finds everyone, no matter how protected their life may have been until that moment. Asterisk. The atmosphere inside the courtroom had shifted after the video finished playing, because what had begun as a routine traffic hearing was now slowly transforming into a moment where a young woman who had lived her entire life protected by wealth and influence was beginning to realize that the protection she relied on did not exist inside those 4 walls. And I could see the first signs of that realization in Alexandra Whitmore's expression as she shifted uncomfortably in her chair. The confidence that had filled her posture when she walked in now slightly weakened, though not yet completely gone, because people who grow up without consequences rarely lose their arrogance all at once. It cracks slowly, piece by piece, and sometimes it takes hearing the truth from the very people they have hurt before that transformation can begin, which is why I turned my attention to Maria Chun and asked if she was prepared to give her statement to the court. And when she stood up, there was nothing dramatic about the way she moved, no anger in her voice, and no desire for revenge. Only the quiet strength of someone who had spent years working around suffering and had learned how to speak honestly, even when emotions were heavy. And as she stepped forward, the entire courtroom seemed to lean closer, not out of curiosity about the wealthy defendant, but because they wanted to hear the voice of the woman whose life had been interrupted by someone else's careless decision. And Maria began by introducing herself simply as a nurse who worked long overnight shifts caring for terminally ill patients, explaining that on the morning of the accident she had been exhausted but determined to get her children to school on time before returning home to rest. And she described how normal the day had seemed just seconds before the crash. The red light ahead, the radio playing quietly, her daughter Emma asking a question about a school project while her son, Michael, looked out the window counting the cars passing by. And then suddenly there had been a violent impact from behind that threw her forward and filled the car with the sound of metal and terrified children. And when she described the moment her daughter screamed and her son asked through tears if they were going to die, the words settled heavily across the courtroom. Because accidents are not just numbers in a police report. They are moments that remain in people's memories long after the vehicles have been repaired or replaced. And Maria continued by explaining how she had stepped out of the car, shaking and disoriented, but still focused on making sure her children were safe, walking toward the driver responsible for the collision, believing they would exchange information like any two adults involved in a crash are expected to do. Yet instead, she was met with a look of irritation rather than concern. A quick glance at the damage followed by a dismissive remark about her car being worthless, and then the driver simply leaving the scene entirely, forcing Maria to stand there in the middle of the intersection trying to calm two frightened children while strangers began calling emergency services. And although the physical injuries she suffered were minor, the emotional effect on her children had been far greater than anything visible in the police report, because Emma had started waking up at night, crying from nightmares about loud crashes and broken glass, while Michael had begun asking every morning whether they would be safe on the drive to school. And as Maria spoke those details quietly and without exaggeration, Alexandra's earlier smirk disappeared completely, replaced by a tight silence as she stared down at the table. And for the first time since the hearing began, she looked less like a confident socialite and more like a young person slowly realizing that her actions had reached far beyond a dented vehicle. Yet the moment that changed the tone of the room even further came when Maria admitted that the hardest part of the entire experience had not been the damage to her car or the financial stress that followed, but the question her 7-year-old daughter had asked a few days later at the kitchen table. Because Emma had looked at her mother with genuine confusion and asked whether being rich meant you were allowed to break the rules and hurt people without getting in trouble. And when Maria repeated that question aloud inside the courtroom, a deep silence fell across every row of seats. Because no legal argument or technical detail can match the honesty of a child trying to understand fairness in the world. And it was in that silence that Alexandra, Whitmore's attorney, finally stood up, attempting to redirect the conversation back toward legal procedures, arguing that while the accident itself was unfortunate, his client had no prior criminal record and therefore deserved leniency. Yet the attempt felt hollow against the emotional weight already filling the room, because the issue before us was no longer simply about a collision at a traffic light, but about the pattern of choices that followed it. The decision to dismiss another person's fear, the decision to leave the scene, the decision to delay reporting the accident while continuing with social activities as though nothing significant had occurred. And when I reviewed Alexandra's driving history aloud, it revealed a pattern that made the situation even clearer. Multiple speeding citations over the past 2 years, a previous reckless driving charge that had quietly been reduced after negotiations by attorneys, and several warnings that had never seemed to change her behavior, each one acting like a small signal that responsibility had never truly been required from her before. And when I asked Alexandra directly whether she understood why leaving the scene of an accident was considered a serious crime. She initially tried to argue that she had not technically run away, but had simply chosen to leave because she believed the situation was minor. Yet even as she spoke those words, it became obvious she was hearing them differently now, recognizing for the first time how detached they sounded from the experience Maria and her children had described only moments earlier. And the tension between those two realities hung in the air like a question waiting to be answered. Because justice is not only about punishment, but also about recognition, about forcing someone to truly see the consequences of their behavior. And as the hearing continued, the confidence Alexandra had carried into the courtroom continued to fade, replaced by a quiet unease that suggested the lesson she had avoided for most of her life was finally approaching. A lesson that would soon make it clear that accountability is not determined by wealth, reputation, or influence, but by the simple and unavoidable truth that every action eventually demands a response from the world around it. Asterisk. By the time the courtroom reached the final stage of the hearing, the energy inside the room had completely transformed from the quiet curiosity that had filled it at the beginning of the morning into something far heavier and more reflective, because everyone present could sense that the moment of accountability had finally arrived. And even Alexandra Whitmore seemed to understand that the confident posture she carried when she first walked through those courtroom doors could no longer protect her from the reality that had unfolded over the past hour. As the testimony, the video evidence, and the simple honesty of Maria Chun's words had painted a picture far more powerful than any legal argument her attorney could offer. And as I looked down at the case file one last time before delivering the decision, I reflected briefly on the purpose of a courtroom itself. Because many people assume that justice is only about punishment, but in truth, it is also about clarity, about forcing people to confront the consequences of their actions in a way that changes how they move through the world afterward. And when I finally spoke, the room became completely silent as I explained that leaving the scene of an accident is not a minor mistake or a misunderstanding, but a serious violation of responsibility, particularly when children were involved and when the person responsible had multiple opportunities to correct the situation and chose not to. And I continued by addressing Alexandra directly, reminding her that while accidents can happen to anyone, the true measure of character is revealed in the moments that follow those accidents. Whether someone chooses empathy and accountability or convenience and denial, and the evidence in this case had made that choice painfully clear, because instead of stopping to help a frightened family, she had dismissed them. Instead of contacting authorities immediately, she had spent the afternoon at a private club, and instead of acknowledging the seriousness of her actions, she had initially attempted to minimize them as though the experience of the people she harmed did not matter. And as those words settled across the courtroom, Alexandra's composure finally began to break, the emotional barrier she had carried for most of the hearing collapsing as the realization that consequences were truly unavoidable reached her fully. And although the law required a structured decision rather than a dramatic speech, the message behind that decision was simple. Because the sentence I announced included 60 days in county jail, a 1-year suspension of her driver's license, full financial restitution for the damage to Maria Chun's vehicle, as well as compensation for the wages she had lost while dealing with the aftermath of the accident, and 200 hours of mandatory community service at the same county hospital where Maria worked as a nurse. A decision designed not only to hold Alexandra accountable, but also to place her directly in an environment where compassion and responsibility were part of everyday life. And the reaction inside the courtroom was immediate as Alexandra gasped in disbelief while her attorney attempted to protest that the punishment was too severe for someone without a formal criminal record. Yet the reality was that the sentence was not based solely on the accident itself, but on the pattern of choices that followed it. and the lack of remorse she had displayed earlier in the hearing. And for a moment, Alexandra turned toward the gallery where her parents had been sitting quietly throughout the proceedings, her voice trembling as she asked her father to do something to stop what was happening. But instead of standing to argue or attempting to influence the court, he simply shook his head slowly and told her that she needed to face the consequences of her own decisions. A response that seemed to shock her almost as much as the sentence itself, because it represented the first time in her life that the protective barrier around her actions had been removed completely. And as the court officers prepared to escort her from the room, Alexandra's earlier confidence had vanished entirely, replaced by tears and confusion, while Maria Chun remained seated quietly with her children beside her, not celebrating the outcome, but simply watching the process unfold with the calm understanding of someone who had asked only for fairness rather than revenge. And before the hearing officially ended, I addressed the courtroom one final time to clarify that the purpose of the decision had never been to punish wealth or privilege. Because money itself is not a crime, and many people with great resources use them responsibly. But the law cannot allow anyone to believe that influence places them above the rules that protect everyone else. And justice only works when every person who enters a courtroom stands on equal ground, regardless of their background. And in the weeks that followed, the case continued to echo quietly beyond the walls of that courtroom, because the story did not end with the sentence itself. As Alexandra served her time without special treatment and later began her community service at the hospital, where she encountered Maria Chun again under very different circumstances. No longer as the careless driver who had